Into the Rising Sun, Operative Spies and Saboteurs, The Brenner Assignment, They Dared Return, We Were One, which was selected for the Marine Commandant's professional reading list, Give Me Tomorrow, and Dog Company. His most recent is First Seals. Patrick's numerous awards include the prestigious William E. Colby Award and the OSS Society's John Waller Award. He has also provided historical consultation for DreamWorks' award-winning miniseries Band of Brothers, and for documentaries produced by the BBC, the History Channel, and Fox News. He served as a combat historian in a Marine rifle platoon during the Battle of Fallujah, and is in demand as an expert speaker on World War II sabotage, special operations, and counterinsurgency on the modern battlefield. Over the past 20 years, O'Donnell has interviewed more than 4,000, I think he said it's now 5,000 veterans who fought in America's wars from World War I to Afghanistan, and specializes in unearthing untold stories that read like novels. Please welcome Patrick K. O'Donnell. Thank you.
Well, it's really a pleasure and honor to be here. This is the beginning of my book tour for First Seals, which just came out this week. As Jim said, I've interviewed 5,000 World War II veterans. I've spent an entire lifetime studying World War II, and the story that I'm going to tell you tonight or today is an untold story, and probably the most interesting story that I've ever come across in the 44 years that I've been here on this earth. The story begins right here in Washington, D.C., only a few blocks away at the Shoreham Hotel. It's November 17, 1942, and the Shoreham Hotel is newly built. It's only been there since 1933. It's kind of the host for presidents and galas and everything else, but that night in 1942, the doors of the pool were barred by armed guards, and they tested something that was unique. They tested the first rebreather. This is a precursor to scuba, and the beginning of the Navy SEALs begins in that pool only a few blocks away from this location right now. That day, it's an eclectic group, a motley crew kind of individuals that form the First SEALs. They're part of the OSS. And that evening, a dentist from Hollywood, California, named Jack Taylor, straps on a rebreather, this first scuba gear, and he starts to go into the pool. And Taylor is an extraordinary individual. He travels halfway around the world by himself, sails yachts, flies planes. Even prior to the war, he dug his way out of a gold mine after being buried alive. This is not your average dentist. And joining him is a young medical student named Christian Lambertson, who has to sneak away from the University of Pennsylvania. Can't even tell his dean what he's doing, but he's developing the first scuba gear, the rebreather. They test it in the pool, and it's a success. Joining them is sort of an unusual person, the British liaison officer in Washington, D.C. His name is H.G.M. Woolley, commander, who was a First World War I veteran, but Woolley's extraordinary. He's able to take an idea and turn it into reality. And that's exactly what they do. It's a race against time. In 1942, the United States doesn't have special operations forces or even an intelligence agency. Everything was kind of based on Cold War, the Spanish-American War mentality. This is a time when gentlemen didn't read gentleman's mail. Special operations didn't exist. It was kind of all born, in many ways, in the mind of one individual who had a vision. General William Donovan, Wild Bill Donovan. He was appointed the chief of something called the OSS. At that time, it was a COI, Coordinator of Information. And this is a time when American intelligence was stovepiped. It didn't. Nothing went to the president. The State Department had some activities for intelligence gathering, the Army, etc. But the Coordinator for Information was to sort of collate that and put it into one package for the president. Didn't completely work that way, but the OSS was dynamic and pioneering, and they found Renaissance men And that's what this book is about. First Seals is about Renaissance men that did some extraordinary things overnight. They had to build the first Navy SEALs. And the entire Washington area that you're part of right now was turned into a spy and special ops training ground. For instance, Congressional Country Club, the fairways there, explosives, combat, knife fighting, etc., was conducted there by the OSS Special Operations groups. This group was called the Maritime Unit, but they didn't have really a spy base at the time, so they had to make it overnight. And what's quite interesting is at a place called Area D, which right now is a bunch of weeds and there's a few remains of buildings, etc. It's directly across from Quantico, Virginia. And that's where they began training these guys. And there was no money at all. They just had an idea, a vision. So there wasn't a submarine available. So what did they do? They rented a rotting cabin cruiser for $50 a month called the Maribel, and they made it a submarine. And they used the rebreather in the muddy waters of the Potomac, and that's where their training began. And these guys, it was unbelievable, the capabilities that they developed, the equipment. For instance, the first miniature submarines, the Sleeping Beauty, which was borrowed from the SOE, they created these devices overnight. As time went on, they had to develop all of this equipment. And not only did the Sleeping Beauty come about, but they also developed parachute operations, etc., combining seaborne operations with airborne operations. The UDTs, no one was, during World War II, was combining all these things together. And it was these these extraordinary individuals that were spurred on by something several months earlier that occurred. In Alexandria Harbor in December 1941, 6 Italians riding human submersibles, human torpedoes effectively, destroyed 2 British battleships in Alexandria. They sunk them, and they changed the entire balance of power in the Eastern Mediterranean overnight. This asymmetric warfare created an underwater arms race with all the world's powers trying to catch up to the Italians. The only group that was equipped to handle this at the time was the OSS. And Donovan assigns Woolley, Taylor, and a small other group of men to sort of solve this problem. They work with Area D comes into effect, and it's from there that things sort of gel. The entire Washington area, as I mentioned, is a training ground. And Taylor is not a chairborne officer. He's a man of action, and he wants to go overseas. And it's early 1943, and he gets assigned, he demands to be assigned to a base in Alexandria, Egypt. He's one man that goes overseas by himself and has to set up effectively an entire Area D. And that's what he does. He's a lowly captain at the time, but he commandeers all these small boats called kayakis, which then infiltrate the entire Eastern Mediterranean. And it's an extraordinary story. This is kind of the time frame of like Guns of Navarone, if you've seen that movie, where the Germans at the time dominate the Eastern Mediterranean. The British are operating on a shoestring along with the Americans, and they occupy several islands like Leros, for instance, and Kos. And the Germans counterattack with this parachute operation, and they take over these islands. And it's quite interesting. Taylor infiltrates inside the islands, delivering critical supplies and also rescuing men. And I spent probably about 10 years researching this story, 10,000 documents. And inside those documents are extraordinary stories. For instance, on the island of Samos, Taylor delivers supplies, and he coordinates with the Archbishop, who's a British intelligence agent. There's an incredible story of this book is rich with characters, interesting characters that are all unique. And one of those people, for instance, is Sterling Hayden, that Taylor interacts with, the famous movie actor. If you've ever seen Dr. Strangelove, for instance, this is General Jack Ripper. And Taylor in World War II is an amazing individual. He changes his name to John Hamilton to sort of cloak his identity to some degree, but everybody kind of like, when he goes to Egypt, for instance, they're like, you look like kind of a famous football player. And they're like, well, yeah, well. Anyways, he's in Alexandria and he meets Taylor, who describes as kind of an oddly chilling guy. But Taylor and Hayden work together, along with another guy who I spent, many of the men in this book were close friends of mine. There's only one living now that I've interviewed. But one of those individuals was a guy by the name of Lloyd Smith. And Lloyd Smith lived right here in McLean, Virginia. And after the war, Lloyd was an accountant. But Lloyd launched one of the most extraordinary spy missions with Hayden and Taylor of World War II. After the escapades in Alexandria, the war shifted to Italy. And Taylor and these men wanted to be part of the action. And one of the first missions that they had was to rescue 25 nurses that crash landed behind enemy lines in a C-47 in Albania. And Albania at the time was occupied by the Germans. It was also a civil war. There were multiple insurgencies going on. And somehow, these guys had to get these nurses out. And they sent in Lloyd Smith, who is this unassuming guy. And I'll never forget, he pulled out this .357 Magnum when I interviewed him. He put it on the table and he goes, "This was Hayden's that I won in a poker game before the mission. And that's what I was armed with when I went in behind the lines." And that's what this college wrestler from Pennsylvania, with hardly any understanding of the culture of Albania, did. With a .357 Magnum, he navigated hundreds of miles and found those nurses and brought them back. And Hayden and Taylor were there to transport them back on a boat that could be made for a movie. It was called the Yankee, and it was an old fishing boat that they repurposed and they camouflaged and they put a .50 caliber machine gun on it, and they brought the nurses out, with one exception. They left 5 behind. And I'll never forget the story. Lloyd told me that after the mission was a success, he was tapped on the shoulder by none other than William Wild Bill Donovan after the mission and said, "Lloyd, congratulations for bringing out the nurses. Now you're going back." And that's exactly what he had to do. They had to redo the entire mission and find those other 5 nurses. And that's what's extraordinary about Donovan. He was a man of action, too. He had participated in most of the amphibious assaults of World War II, including D-Day. And Smith goes back, and they find the nurses, and they bring them back. And that's sort of those are some of the missions that are quite extraordinary. But as this is going on, the OSS maritime unit is mushrooming from just this handful of men that are chosen from the Navy, the Marine Corps, the Coast Guard, the Merchant Marine, and they're formed into teams of underwater combat operatives. These are combat swimmers, and they're using the LRU that's developed here at the Shoreham Hotel, and it goes through a series of phases. And the OSS picks the best swimmers in America, and many of them come from California. Many of these guys are surfers, believe it or not. They're national champion swimmers. Some are Olympic caliber swimmers, but they form into several teams. And the teams are unique. For instance, four decades before SEAL Team 6 conducts red cell exercises, these guys infiltrate Gitmo with all the harbor defenses completely active. They go through all the nets, they go through all the underwater obstacles, the mines, etc. They're fully armed, and the base is fully armed, and they're not made aware that the maritime unit is going to infiltrate it, and they successfully do it. Those are some of the things that are sort of developing, and these teams are then sent overseas. For instance, they conduct the first submarine-based SEAL-type exercise on board a submarine called the Burfish, where they do a reconnaissance on a small Japanese island that's occupied. Several of these maritime unit men are killed in action. And these missions kind of go forward. Many of them are forgotten stories. I mean, I combed the archives and found missions in Burma, Sumatra, for instance, where the OSS wasn't necessarily a politically correct outfit. When they needed agents and operatives, they would find a way to get them. For instance, the native Sumatrans that were in these waters outside of Sumatra were sometimes just basically shanghaied into service, and then they were trained as agents. And several of those missions, these men were put back behind the lines. And in an unsung story of the war, many of them lost their lives, and they have never received that recognition. But that leads to sort of the next mission that I'd like to talk about, where these deserter volunteers, if you will, the OSS needs to find people, and they for Austria. And Jack Taylor is obsessed with being behind the lines, and he conducts at the time the deepest penetration into the Third Reich in a mission called the DuPont mission. And DuPont is made up of 3 of these deserter volunteers. The OSS goes through the camps of Italy to comb out Wehrmacht soldiers that had fought in the German army but had Allied leanings. Many of them were communists or socialists. And these men were recruited to become agents in the OSS. And Taylor forms a team of 3 of these individuals. And they are put together, and they drop on Friday the 13th, sort of an ominous day for many ways for this mission, because they're dropped out by a Polish crew that drops them over the drop zone in Austria, and their mission is to gather intelligence on sort of the local German manufacturing, jet manufacturing, etc. in the area, as well as something called the Southwest Wall, which is the Germans are building in Austria. And here, Taylor and his team drop in to gather intelligence, and from the start, sort of everything goes wrong. The mission radio is the lifeline. If you don't have a radio behind the lines in Nazi Germany, you're as good as dead. And sadly, the radio, they think, dropped into a lake. So these men were behind the lines in the most dangerous part of the world at the time, Nazi Germany, without a lifeline. And somehow they maneuvered and worked their way around in safe houses that the team members at the time of the DuPont mission they had relatives in the area, and they stayed within these safe houses. And the DuPont team, these deserter volunteers, were very sort of an eclectic group, a mixed bag in many ways. One guy was a philanderer, for instance, that had this penchant for womanizing with the local German population. And in the end, that is what tips off the Gestapo to the DuPont team, as they moved around for over 2 months behind the lines, and they gather really good intelligence, but they're just not able to transmit it back. And the Gestapo surrounds a barn that the men are staying in, and they come in with MP40 machine pistols, and they jab it in the ribs of the team members, and they ask who Taylor is, and he says that he's a captain. And then they start to beat him. And as this is kind of going on, in Italy, there's an interesting dynamic also occurring. As I mentioned earlier, this unit called Decima Mas, which the Italian Navy, it's one of their most successful units. They sink 2 British battleships in Alexandria. They They conduct a number of operations that are highly successful. They sink a large portion of Allied tonnage of ships. Italy in early 43 changes sides, and the OSS is out of the box and dynamic thinkers. They say, why not take these assets and bring them into the fold? And that's exactly what they did with an element of Decima Mas called the San Marco Battalion. And these men, Taylor was initially part of organizing and also negotiating this. They conduct special operations missions behind the lines, and they conduct these missions by gathering intelligence as well. It's fascinating. They capture high-value targets. They conduct some assassinations. And one of their greatest coups was that Italy at the time was made up of belts of German fortifications. They captured, or they actually brought back, an Italian engineer that had designed the Gothic line. And they knew every single bunker, machine gun nest, mortar position, artillery position, etc. They brought the engineer back along with all the plans, and this led through to one of the breakthroughs that the British Army had in that sector. But they conducted countless missions, blowing up trains and railroad tracks, etc. All of these things are sort of happening at the same time as Taylor is now captured by the Gestapo. And I think, I mentioned that Jack Taylor had survived digging out of a gold mine, but it's here that Jack Taylor has kind of the ultimate survivor story. He's put into Mauthausen concentration camp as an American and somehow has to survive. And the camp itself is savage. There's no food. Men have to beat each other just for a crumb of bread. Taylor is assigned to build the crematorium in the camp. This is where the bodies are dumped and burned. And somehow, brick by brick, he's under the point of a gun. He builds the crematorium, and he slowly builds this thing because he knows that any day he's going to be dead as soon as he's done with it. And the Germans insist that it's done quicker, and they speed up the clock. And practically every day, Jack Taylor is on the death list, which is a list of any of the inmates in that camp that are going to be executed by the Germans. And this savagery is unbelievable at Mauthausen. They have a quarry, for instance, where there are hundreds of steps, and the inmates are sadistically forced to quarry on their backs massive stones up and down the steps. And the Germans, for fun, effectively throw these individuals off the steps. They call something called paratrooper. And if the individual survives, they throw them off again. They're viciously assaulted and tortured. Dogs, etc. They're forced to stand outside in the cold for 24 hours at a time. And somehow, Jack Taylor survives this entire camp. And I think the most extraordinary thing in this story is the day Jack Taylor's they plan to execute Jack Taylor the next day. And it's May 1945. And an armored division, an Allied armored division, crashes through the front gates of Mauthausen. And they find this ragged, this is a man that was initially 185 pounds. He's now withered down to probably about 120 pounds. He's in bedraggled clothes, and as they come through the gate, he holds up his dog tags and goes, "God bless America," as they crash through the gates. And if you want to see something really extraordinary, Google Jack Taylor plus Mauthausen, and there's a grainy old film with this exact incident in Taylor's own words. And as this is all unfolding, and he says, after that he says, "I'm Jack Taylor. I'm a naval officer from Hollywood, California. This is my first time in the movies." As as 1945 goes on, the war is coming to a close, and the maritime unit of the OSS, these first SEALs, are mothballed, along with the rest of the organization. All of the technology, a lot of it is put on shelves. The Sleeping Beauty, the rebreather, is warehoused. Kind of think of the Indiana Jones scene with the large warehouse. Most of this equipment is put in one of those large warehouses. And only a few years after that, the UDTs resurrect a lot of it. And they bring back Dr. Lambertson. And they bring back John Booth, one of the individuals that's on this book. One of the extraordinary friends that I had. Many of these men were close friends of mine. John, for instance, every year would travel from Rhode Island to Key West, Florida, and he would stop at my house in Virginia and spend 2 weeks there. My daughter would know him as Uncle John, and Uncle John, at 90 years old, would dive in Key West, swim out 2 miles, and obtain lobsters and bring them back, and that was his dinner. He would also take his CIA pension and save it for cigars and booze at the local DAV and hit on hotties at age 91. But this is the kind of, these men were living life up and to the end, and they are Renaissance men. I mean, another character that I didn't even mention in this book was a guy by the name of Ted Mord, who was an archaeologist that found the lost temple of the monkey god. This is a true story, in Honduras. And Mord could have been the character from Indiana Jones, easily. And Mord is with Taylor and Hayden in Italy, and even conducts his own mission in China. But the story of the maritime unit is an interesting one. And for me, it was really an honor to be able to sort of tell some of the stories of my friends and the men that I found in the lost files at the National Archives. So with that, I'd like to take your questions. Yes, sir.
I want to thank you very much for your thank you very much for your great presentation today. It's wonderful to hear your recounting of these stories. Chris Lambertson was a personal friend of mine for many years. What led you to have an interest in this discipline more so than anything else, please?
For me, the interest in World War II history began when I was about 4. I started collecting a series of magazines called The History of the Second World War, and every week I'd go up with my father, and at the newsstand we'd buy a new edition. There was 138 parts or whatever, and it was the entire history of the war. And that was sort of the genesis of it. And then I started interviewing the men themselves. And as I mentioned, it's been about 5,000 interviews. And all of those interviews have been with special operators from World War II primarily, as well as modern day special operatives, special forces, special operations forces, everything from the Marine Raiders to the Rangers of Dog Company, for instance, at Pointe du Hoc, to the 1st Special Service Force. But for me, the most interesting group that I had ever interviewed were the men and women of the OSS, because they had maintained their vows of silence. They were a very, very difficult group to interview. And it was through years of research. I've written 4 books on the OSS. First one being Operative Spies and Saboteurs, the next one being the Brenner Assignment, They Dared Return, and now First SEALs. And those individuals entrusted me with their story. And that is the thing that I think runs across all of my books, is that trust. And that's not something that's easily obtained. Either, with the Marines that I was with in Fallujah, for instance, who trusted me with their stories, to these OSS veterans. Next question.
Questions, anyone?
Yes. Speaking in Alabama. Well, I wouldn't necessarily say that. I would say that 10 years ago to this day, though, that I was in the Battle of Fallujah, and that was a very seminal event in my life. And last week we went to Camp Pendleton, California, and I had met men that I had not seen in 10 years. And that was a very powerful experience. And we hiked up this long ridge line. It took 6 miles of there and back, and we memorialized the 57 men that were killed in action in Fallujah, in 3-1 alone, the battalion that I was in. And then there was also many men had taken their lives since the war. So the memorial service was not just about the dead, it was about the living. And there's a great, if you're interested, there's a great story that NPR did yesterday, as a matter of fact, on that day. And it was written in this book, We Were One, which is about the platoon that I was in Fallujah. Thank you. I have. Several actually, and I've had 2 of my books made into films. One, They Dared Return, which is it's a true story behind Inglourious Bastards, and it's called The Real Inglourious Bastards, the film that they made, and it won a Canadian Emmy Award. And then there's been several documentaries for the History Channel. For instance, We Were One. There's a great thing called Shootout D-Day Fallujah, where they reenacted the ambush that I was involved in with I was almost killed by Chechens. And they interviewed the men, and they reenacted the entire ambush. And then one of my favorite books is called Give Me Tomorrow, which is on the Korean War, and it's on George Company 3-1, the same unit that we were in Fallujah, but in Korea. And when I came back from Camp Pendleton, I was greeted by these old senior Marines who said to me, who are you? And I'm like, well, I'm a combat historian. They're like, well, we were George Company 3-1. You carried the battle guide on that we had. And then they said, we held a key hill in the Chosin Reservoir against an entire Chinese regiment. I said, wow, that's pretty amazing. A small company of 180 men against a Chinese regiment, maybe 2,500 strong, maybe more. How'd they do that? And they said, come to our reunion, Pat. That's how the next book began, Give Me Tomorrow. For me, it's all kind of like stories seem to find me. Seems sort of serendipitous. And like I say, I haven't worked in 15 years. It's been all my passion. It's been fun, just being able to sort of tell and record the stories of World War II veterans and Korean War veterans and veterans of today. Thank you very much.
Pat, before you go, I have a question. One final question. I saw Shootout Fallujah. Thought it was a terrific documentary. Could you just talk a bit about the battle? I've always found that fascinating, and what our Army soldiers and Marines were up against in terms of the jihadists who were there and so forth. I mean, we've had several guys who were in that. Era speakers. So
this story that Jim's talking about is in a book called We Were One, and I've written 10 books. It's probably the most special book, personal book in many ways, because I was there, and Fallujah was very much like the Pacific War, in the sense that the positions that we had to encounter were bunkered. The enemy was determined, in some cases suicidal. They were there to kill Americans. And what we found on the ground all over the place was these syringes that were filled, or actually they were not filled, they were liquid adrenaline these guys were shooting themselves up with. And you can sort of picture a PCP user, somebody that is fearless and also can sustain a large amount of damage. We saw insurgents that had sustained 14 gunshot wounds to their body that went right through them, and they continued to fight. Entire buildings were collapsed on individuals, and they continued to fight under the rubble on us. It was a very, it was a battle that changed many of our lives. And I will just say that in many ways, there are many lessons that can be learned from Fallujah on the current day, in terms not necessarily of the battle itself, but afterwards with the Anbar Awakening. And in many ways, that's the key to success as moving forward. Thank you.